Hunt of the Dead is the #1 film with critics. It's amazing, says wellowcinema.com. Filmmaster Adam calls it an okay time, I guess. Entertainment Weekly raves, who are you people? Ethan Dunlap of Digital Fix says, it combines killing and grave robbing, which are two of my favorite pastimes. R.L. King of Cinema Slam hails, I saw the movie, now where's my family? Fred D proclaims, it's cool, so yeah. Jigsaw of Lords of Gaming says, who are you? Leave me alone. So check out the #1 movie in America and with critics.
Hall of Mirrors, Tales of Horror and the Grotesque, written and performed for podcast by Mike Bennetts. This podcast is intended for an adult audience. Hello, listeners, and welcome once again. This week, we come to the conclusion of Hair and Skin, the 5th mirror in the collection here in the Hall of Mirrors. My goodness, is it only 5 stories? It seems like such a long time, and yet like no time at all. Like a fitful dream, perhaps, a beautiful nightmare that you awake from, sweat-soaked, heart-pounding, terrified, and yet excited, dying to return, even though you know you may die in your sleep if you do. But of course I exaggerate. Why, the only way you might work up a sweat listening to this podcast is if you're listening at the gym, which I know some of you do. But this week, listeners, be warned, for even those of you lying down naked in a field blanketed in virgin snow, and I know some of you do, you may find a bead or two of sweat breaking upon your chilly brows. For this week, Charles Mason, millionaire chicken magnate and man with a bizarre hair dilemma, comes face to face with his one-time friend and personal hair restoration surgeon, Conrad de Vere. And Charles isn't alone, for he brings more under his hat than just 2 rather messy beard transplants. He brings the damned and tormented spirits of the beard's murdered owners, Bale and Tweed. When last we saw Charles, he was pushing open the door to De Vere's building and slowly climbing the stairs. But De Vere, what is he doing? Having admitted Charles, he has only moments to prepare for his unwanted guest, or guests, if you will. What will he do in the moments that pass as Charles, Bale and Tweed ascend the stairs to their mutual destiny? This is our entry point, listeners, as the glass begins to settle on the stricken face of Conrad de Vere and the destiny of all the unfortunate inhabitants of this tale of hair and skin. De Vere ran back into his operating theatre, tearing his bloody apron from around him as he went. There was no time to hide all the signs of his crimes before Mason got up to the office. He'd just have to shut it all in here and wait till the stupid fool had left. He ran over to the wash basin and snatched up a small bar of soap. He turned on the tap and thrust his gore-streaked arms beneath the flow of water, rubbing the soap frantically between his hands and over his wrists as the water carried the traces of his most recent atrocity down the drain in an incarnadine swirl. The distant sound of a fist striking the door of the front office. De Vere grabbed a towel and dried his hands. He wondered again at what it was that he'd heard Charles say down there about London's homeless. Could it be that he knew? Could he have connected the face in the paper with his own? If so, what was this? Surely the fool didn't hope to blackmail him. No, the man was richer than royalty. What then? Surely he wasn't here to try and talk him into giving himself up to the authorities. He closed the door to the theatre and hurried up the hall to the front office, rolling down his shirt sleeves and buttoning his cuffs as he went. Once in, he closed the door to the hall and took a moment to compose himself. He smoothed his hair, checked his general appearance in the mirror, then walked calmly across to the front office door and opened it. De Vere had no time to think, no time to raise his hands in front of him to try to stop or hinder Mason. The man was upon him as soon as the door opened. Soaking wet, wearing a crumpled white suit and a ruined straw hat, Mason charged him like a mad bull. De Vere cried out as he fell back onto the floor. Mason followed him down, diving upon him like an overzealous lover, panting and spraying De Vere's face with spittle. De Vere shrieked, grabbing ineffectually at Mason's arms and trying to throw him off balance. Mason didn't even blink. He seized De Vere by the throat and squeezed.
"Hello, De Vere. Remember us?"
De Vere gripped at Mason's hands and struggled to break his grip. The part of his mind that wasn't ablaze with panic fixed on the pronoun Mason had used. Us. What did he mean by that? The question fell apart in his mind as Mason began to shake him violently. The tattered hat fell from his head, and De Vere's mind struggled with the sight that its falling revealed. The hair and skin that he had so carefully grafted just over a week ago now hung in ragged flaps from a scalp that looked as though it had been flayed. De Vere gave up pulling at Mason's hands and reached up to claw at his face, trying frantically to connect with the man's eyes. Mason responded by holding his head up and out of reach. Then suddenly Mason winced, and De Vere watched with a mixture of horror and professional fascination as blood began to spurt in thin gouts from either side of Mason's scalp. More blood flowed in rivulets through what remained of Mason's hair transplant, running over his face and spreading down onto De Vere's scrabbling hands.
"Why did you do it, De Vere?"
Mason shouted.
"Why? I gave you money for the donors. Why did you have to murder them?"
De Vere felt a darkness reaching for him, rising like cold water around his consciousness. He felt the strength draining from his arms and the pain in his throat begin to lessen as a sense of euphoria began to overcome him. His hands fell from Mason's face as he watched through a rising mist as Mason relaxed his straining neck and lowered his head a little. The darkness closed over De Vere, comfortable now, like sleep, drifting. Then a lightning flash across the darkness as panic forced its way back into his mind, and with it a final rush of adrenaline. De Vere grabbed at Mason's blood-soaked face and, finding slippery purchase, sank both of his trembling thumbs into his attacker's eyes. Mason howled in agony, releasing De Vere's throat and tumbling back. His vision burned behind a red and black cascade, and from somewhere beyond that cascade he could hear De Vere coughing, choking, gasping for breath. From the right-hand side of his head, Tweed screamed,
"You bastard, De Vere! You murdering bastard! Did you really think you could get away with it? What did you do with our bodies, De Vere?"
cried Bale.
"What did you do with the wastage? The bits you couldn't sew onto someone else?"
De Vere managed to get to his feet, massaging his throat. He ignored the questions and aimed a vicious kick at Charles's bloody face. "How did you find out, Charles? Read about it in the papers, did you? Hardly a flattering likeness, but obviously good enough to arouse your suspicions." Charles spat blood, his vision beginning to clear.
"So, it is true, then. You did kill them."
De Vere smiled contemptuously. "Of course. But what's it to you? You've got your new hair, haven't you? Though I have to say, it looks as though you've been taking rather rotten care of it. What have you been doing, Charles? You're obviously not using Head and Shoulders."
"Conrad, please, call the police and turn yourself in."
De Vere laughed. "And why would I want to do that, Charles? Just as I'm on my way to my first $1,000,000 and a one-way ticket to Brazil, far away from this insufferable existence as your pet surgical stooge. I can be a proper surgeon again, Mason. What do you think of that?"
"Please, Conrad, the police. Call the police."
Charles was cut off by another kick to his face. He screamed with shock and rolled into a fetal position, his arms thrown protectively over his face. "Will you shut up about the bloody police, Mason? I'm surprised you didn't bring them yourself," said De Vere, wiping the blood from his shoe on the seat of Charles's trousers. "In fact, that's odd. Why didn't you? Why didn't you just call the police yourself?"
"They wouldn't let me,"
said Charles, keeping his arms crossed over his face. "What? Who wouldn't let you? What are you talking about?"
"Tweed,"
Charles snuffled.
"Bale and Tweed."
De Vere frowned, confused. He hadn't known his first two victims by name, though he had subsequently read about their identities in the newspapers. Obviously, Charles had done so too. "You don't mean—"
"That's right, De Vere. You murdering bastard,"
came a strange, hissing voice from Charles.
"Bale and Tweed, all the way from hell. And we're taking you back with us."
De Vere stared at the wadded bundle of arms and legs at his feet. The voice had definitely come from Charles, but it hadn't sounded anything like him. Perhaps his nose was bleeding into his throat and he was speaking through blood and phlegm. Evidently the man had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. De Vere laughed nervously. "I see, Charles. Guided by voices, are we?"
"They're here, De Vere,"
said Charles piteously.
"Here with me, in my head."
"Oh dear," said De Vere, shaking his head. "That must be quite uncomfortable for you."
"What did you do with us?"
came the strange, hissing voice again. De Vere shook his head. "Oh, the $1,000,000 question, He smoothed his hair back into place. It was too bad that Mason had to die. He was high profile and directly connected to him. Still, there were ways and means. He smiled affably. "Very well, Charles. You say you'd like to know what I did with the bodies?
Yes. Tell us.
Very well, then. I'll go one better. I'll show you. De Vere extended a hand, though Charles, his face still enveloped by his arms, didn't notice. De Vere sighed. Oh, come on, Mason. Do you want to know, or don't you? Charles warily lowered his arms. His eyes were closed and wet with blood. Can you see all right? Asked De Vere. Charles opened his eyes and looked straight back at De Vere.
We can see just fine,
he said, taking the offered hand and getting to his feet. Oh, we. I see. It's we now, is it? Said De Vere, leading the way over to the hallway door. Well, come on then, all of you, and I'll show you what became of the rest of your bits. De Vere opened the door and led the way down the short hall. Charles followed, grimacing at the suffocating smell that filled the windowless space, a chemical odour, redolent of hospitals, sweet, antiseptic, and yet there was something else beneath it, something that reminded him of his own battery farms, something charnel. Charles stopped and steadied himself against the wall, trying to ignore the grinding of Bale and Tweed's teeth and stay focused on De Vere, who now turned to him from the door at the end of the corridor. You're looking a bit peaky, Charles. What's the matter? Lost your curiosity all of a sudden?
Come on, Charles,
Tweed hissed.
Don't go to jelly on us now. Yeah, shake a leg, Charles,
said Bale.
Don't you want to know what that bastard's been up to?
No, Charles moaned. Sorry, said De Vere.
Does this hurt, Charles?
Said Bale, and he bit down on his tongue. Charles screamed and clutched at his head.
Oh, stop it! Stop it!
De Vere watched in astonishment. This was worse than he had thought. Mason had gone completely insane. He took a step towards him. Charles?
No,
said Charles, holding up a hand to stay De Vere.
Go ahead, De Vere. I'm coming.
Bale stopped biting his tongue and smiled.
Attaboy, Charles. Now get going.
Charles steadied himself and walked on down the corridor, the smell thickening around him as he approached the last door. A foul, sulphurous odour. He stopped, eye to eye with De Vere, and managed to curl his lip in a sneer of defiance at the other man's sanctimonious smile.
Go ahead, Doctor. Open it.
De Vere lay his hand on the door-handle and opened the door. Charles had seen and experienced a lot in the last week, yet somehow none of it had prepared him for the horror that waited beyond that door. On a metal operating table in the centre of the room lay a dismembered human torso. The head was still attached, although the lower half of the face was a mutilated mess. The beard had been removed, sliced away to expose the raw, wet muscle and sinew beneath. The man's jawbone showed white in particularly hacked places, and his yellow teeth grinned in a grotesque rictus at the bright lights positioned above. The arms and legs had been removed. One arm lay where it had fallen beside the operating table, reaching out to Charles from a pool of blood on the white floor tiles. It was one of many such pools, and Charles noticed bloody footprints tracking everywhere around the room. His eyes followed the tracks along the bloodiest trail to a metal table covered with a scattering of surgical instruments, They included numerous serrated edged tools, among them a large hacksaw, its teeth dark and clogged with gore. Charles felt faint and looked away, following footprints again, this time to a large aquarium on a table against the far wall. The water inside looked like it had been drawn from the Thames, dirty, far too dirty for any fish to live in. Perhaps De Vere was keeping eels. "Forgive the mess," chuckled De Vere. "But this is what happens when people drop by unannounced. Why, I barely had time to wash my hands, let alone tidy up." Charles felt his stomach give a lurch. He belched. "Manners, Charles," said De Vere. He walked over to a small table beside the corpse and lifted what looked like small, flattened roadkill. It was the dead man's beard. "What do you think, Charles? Fancy a new look?"
"You're mad, De Vere,"
said Charles. De Vere laughed. "I'm mad? You charge in here trying to strangle me, driven, you say, by the collective will of a couple of dead men you say are living in your head, and you call me mad? Really?"
"What did you do with us, De Vere?"
came a voice from Charles.
"What did you do with our bodies?"
"Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. That was the purpose of this little tour of ours, wasn't it?" De Vere dropped the beard back into the tray and strolled over to the instrument table. He picked up the hacksaw, smiled, and returned to the corpse. He took hold of the big toe of the dead man's left foot. "This little piggy went to market. Eh, Mason?" De Vere pressed the saw to the toe joint, and with one deft stroke he severed it. The foot dropped back onto the table with a dull, metallic thud. De Vere tossed the toe lightly into the air and caught it as he walked over to the aquarium. "You know, Charles, there are few things these days which the thoroughly unscrupulous former medical professional cannot procure on the black market." De Vere held the toe over the murky liquid. "Large quantities of sulphuric acid present little difficulty. You just have to know the right people." De Vere held the toe over the murky liquid. He dropped the toe into the liquid, and immediately it began to churn and fizz, surging around the toe like water around an Alka-Seltzer tablet. Charles felt something inside of his head recoil with rage. Both of the mouths on his scalp clenched their teeth, trembling with a fury that suddenly broke from him in two deafening screams. Charles instinctively threw his hands over his ears, but this gave no relief from the terrible sound. He pushed his hands up the sides of his head, clamping his hands over the screaming mouths and staggering backwards, dimly aware that he too was now screaming like a bedlamite. De Vere saw his chance. He turned and reached into the pocket of his jacket where it lay draped over the back of a chair. He withdrew a small brown bottle and a handkerchief. Quickly, he splashed a generous quantity of the contents of the bottle onto the handkerchief. The smell of the chloroform rose to his nose, oblivion tickling at his senses. "Good night, Vienna," he whispered, skirting around the room and up behind Charles. Charles was howling, trapped in the private vortex of Bale and Tweed's rage and misery, when he felt De Vere pounce against his back. He felt bony arms encircle his neck, and then something soft and wet pressing against his nose and mouth. Charles opened his mouth and tasted chemicals. Chloroform! The realization shone momentarily, then began to fade like a light in the fog as the sharp edges of the world began to soften and blur.
"De Vere! You bastard!"
came a wet but strangely unmuffled voice from Charles. De Vere pushed the handkerchief harder against Charles's mouth. He could feel the impression of lips and teeth trapped beneath his hand, so how could Mason possibly be speaking? Suddenly, Charles threw his great weight backwards into De Vere, sending him crashing backwards and down to the floor. De Vere, desperate for the chloroform to take effect, held on to Charles as he fell, bringing the big man down on top of him. De Vere managed a momentary howl before the air was knocked out of his lungs.
"Kill the bastard!"
screamed Bale. De Vere's handkerchief fell from Charles's face, and Charles rolled clear, coughing and heaving deep lungfuls of air.
"Now, while he's down,"
hissed Tweed.
"kill him, Charles!"
Charles crawled groggily towards the table of surgical tools. He could hear De Vere moving and scraping behind him.
"Come on, Charles,"
said Bale.
"he's getting up. Forget the silverware. Use that,"
said Tweed, directing Charles's eyes to the severed arm.
"Oh my God!"
said Charles.
"Use it!"
Bale and Tweed screamed in unison. Charles reached out and took the severed arm by its hand. He heard the voice of his own mind screaming in revulsion at the cold, lifeless touch as he closed his fingers on it. Then he heard the sound of footfalls running on the tiles behind him. He didn't think, he acted, whether at his own direction or at someone else's. He swung the severed arm in an arc with all his strength, twisting with the swing and watching as the ragged shoulder muscle caught De Vere under the chin. Blood burst from the limb in a red and black gush that flew through the air, along with the scalpel that had, a moment before, been clasped in De Vere's hand. De Vere crashed into the operating table, grabbing at it to stop his fall, and instead upsetting it, pulling the corpse down with him as he fell.
"Now,"
said Tweed.
"finish him! An eye for an eye!"
shouted Bale. Somewhere Charles could hear his own voice repeating, "No! No! No!" But it was drowned beneath Bale and Tweed's screams for vengeance. Charles staggered across the room, his hand stitched Italian loafers, slipping and sliding on the bloody tiles before he dropped his full weight down onto De Vere, his knees crashing onto the doctor's shoulders and pinning him mercilessly. De Vere groaned and thrashed futilely beneath him, barely able to breathe. "Please, Charles, for pity's sake, I helped you. I only did what you wanted me to. Please." De Vere wheezed, all trace of cool superiority gone and replaced with frightened desperation.
"I never wanted any of this,"
said Charles, shaking the severed arm in front of De Vere's face.
"I never wanted murder."
Charles took the limb by the wrist and elbow joints and held it over De Vere's throat, then stopped. De Vere's eyes were mad with fear.
But this is murder, Charles. Can't you see that? If you kill me, that makes you a murderer too. You'll be no better than me."
De Vere stammered hysterically. Charles snuffled and began making a weird, keening noise. He held the amputation poised and trembling over De Vere's throat, seemingly lost in an almost trance-like state. A moment passed, and De Vere thought he sensed doubt in Mason. The man was confused. Whatever strange, new wiring it was that crackled in his head, it seemed to have somehow shorted out. De Vere swallowed and tried to steady his breathing. The tattered remains of the beards grafted to Mason's scalp flapped in front of his forehead as he continued to keen and whine. They began to drip blood onto de Vere's face, and it was only with a supreme effort of self-control that de Vere managed not to scream. He tried to relax his expression into some semblance of a smile, then, with his best shot at professional cheer, he whispered, "Charles?" Charles's eyes blinked and came to focus, and a voice, one of the voices Charles seemed to be playing the ventriloquist with, shattered the stillness like a brick through a plate glass window.
"Kill him, Charles!"
Another voice joined in, two voices chorusing impossibly together.
"Kill him! Kill him! Kill him! Kill him!"
Charles leaned forward and pushed down hard on the elbow and wrist of the severed arm. He watched with eyes he knew he shared with others as de Vere's tongue began to swell and protrude from his gaping mouth. He watched the frantic eyes as they darted about in desperate hope of some impossible salvation, felt the arms pinned beneath him, thrashing about for something, anything to grasp at. They settled on the wet folds of Charles's trousers, their clutching and pulling now going unnoticed, as, for the first time, Charles noticed an old Timex watch on the wrist of the severed arm. The second hand still moved beneath the cracked and blood-smeared surface. 10:33, and Charles tilted his head to get a better look. 17 seconds. Is that all? He wondered. And that part of his mind, still inhabited solely by Charles Mason, marvelled at the way time had flown since he'd landed at Gatwick Airport. That mind now drifted completely from the man dying beneath him, and took refuge in the precise movements of the Timex. Charles even managed to ignore the voices that screamed from his skull, over and over, the same thing.
"Die, de Vere! Die, de Vere! Die!"
Finally, Charles felt de Vere's last desperate spasm of struggle pass, and the body beneath him eased into stillness. Charles looked down at de Vere's face. The dead man's eyes stared at him with what appeared to be a look of confusion. Charles threw aside the arm and allowed himself to go slack, rolling off the body of de Vere and coming to rest against the other dismembered corpse. He felt nothing. He was past caring now, past the fear, the horror, the revulsion. He was just tired.
"Are you happy now?"
said Charles calmly.
"He's dead."
Bale and Tweed made no reply. Charles frowned, irritated by the silence.
"Well, you've got your eye for an eye. Now go. Be gone. Get back to hell to greet him or whatever it is you want to do."
Charles waited for the taunting response, but it didn't come. He listened intently to the world without and within himself. There was only silence. Charles raised his hands to his head and carefully began to trace his fingers through the ruin of his scalp, trying to locate the mouths. Their beards, the transplants, were coming apart from him, almost physically crawling away from him. But inside, were Bale and Tweed gone? He ignored the pain as he pushed and groped through the tangled, gory mess, prying at what had until so recently been mouths, and now were just wounds again. He felt a wave of relief pass through him, and he laughed nervously. Terrible wounds, that's all they were. Wounds that needed the attention of a surgeon, yes, but only wounds, only... That was when the wound under his left hand smiled.
"Sorry, Charles,"
said Bale.
"Change of plan.
"No," whispered Charles.
No.
Yes, Charles,
said Tweed.
You said you'd go. You said you'd leave when Devere was dead. An eye for an eye. Well, he's dead. And you? You have to go now. We had a deal.
A fair transaction,
chuckled Bale.
Yes!
Screamed Charles, struggling to his feet.
A fair transaction!
Tweed answered with a calm, unemotional
no.
Charles was incredulous.
What?
We won't go. Not yet.
What do you mean?
Who killed Devere, Charles?
Asked Bale. Charles winced as the mouths on his head smiled.
What? No. You did. You killed him. I was your tool, but you killed him.
Tweed laughed.
Oh, but we're dead, Charles. How could we have murdered anybody? Surely you must realize that you are Devere's murderer.
No, Charles whispered.
Yes, Charles. You are a murderer, just like Devere said you would be. You two are just as bad as each other. Two peas in a pod,
said Bale.
No!
Charles shouted, a note of hysteria in his voice now.
No! You did it! You killed Devere!
Turn yourself in, Charles,
said Bale.
There's a phone in the other room. Call the police and tell them what you've done. Then we'll be even,
said Tweed.
No! No!
Cried Charles.
I didn't do it! I never killed anyone! You did it! You used me!
Suddenly, Bale began to scream in a voice that went through Charles like an axe splitting rotten wood.
Police! Police! I'm a murderer!
Tweed joined in.
Murder! Murder! I'm a murderer!
No!
Screamed Charles.
Please! Stop it! Leave me alone!
He clapped his hands over their mouths and felt teeth snap and bite at his palms. He screamed and pulled his hands away.
You monsters! Monsters!
He looked down at his palms where blood was beginning to trickle into the impressions left by their teeth. The dead men continued their chanting over and over.
I'm a murderer! Murder! Murder!
No!
Charles wailed. He punched at his tattered scalp, but it had no effect. The voices wouldn't stop. They were getting louder and louder. Charles looked around for something to gag them with, something to stuff into their mouths and silence their screaming, shouting holes once and for all. Then his eyes fell upon the aquarium, the acid bath. Charles let out a wail that became a long, twisted laugh, but it was almost inaudible beneath the lunatic shouting that filled the room, bouncing off the tiles and resounding around without end. Charles stumbled over the bodies on the floor and staggered to the tank. He laid his hands cautiously, almost reverently on the glass and stared at the foul, untroubled liquid within. Bale and Tweed roared and shouted, gnashed and spat, while slowly Charles's expression rippled from a grimace into a smile. Then he laughed, a laugh that spiraled into a scream in order to be heard above the clamour in his head.
Won't leave me, eh? Won't honour your side of the bargain? Well, this is my head, and I'll be damned if I'm going to share it with you two bastards any longer.
Charles gripped the tank by its rim and pulled himself forwards, plunging his scalp into the acid. The pain struck him with incredible force, and he felt his back convulse as his body's every reflex attempted to pull him clear of the agony. But Charles could hear the screams of his tormentors. Even though their mouths were submerged beneath the hissing, bubbling, blood-clouded turmoil, he could hear them screaming, and it was this that tightened his grip on the edge of the tank and held him fast. Even as the tendrils of acrid smoke rose around his darkening world and the voices became choked and broken, Charles could hear them screaming, and he wasn't pulling out until he heard them stop. And so,